Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison Thulis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.
Good morning. We start this morning with general questions, and our first question is from Alex Rowley.
Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government what progress has been made in addressing the deficit that was built into Fife and Health and Social Care Partnership when it was established.
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
The opening budget deficit dating from the establishment of the IJB in 2016-17 has reduced to just under 9 million since that time. Further progress will be made on this over the coming year. This is a deficit which needs to be addressed by NHS Fife and Fife Council, and together with COSLA, we are engaging with them and the IJB to support their plans to systematically reduce the deficit without reducing capacity by redesigning services and delivery and investing in quality, sustainable care.
Alex Rowley.
I really say to the Health Secretary that that is not an acceptable position for us to be in. The bottom line is that the Chief Executive of NHS Fife wrote to me just last week, and he says, and I quote, "As we move into 2019-20, the budget position remains challenged with an estimated £15 million budget gap. They've had to bail out the IGB in this current year, and that's on top of this deficit that they started with. And the only answer the Scottish Government seems to have is that NHS Fife and Fife Council will instruct the IGB to cut services. Does she not realise that they are struggling to deliver services? And will she commit to meet with the co-leaders of Fife Council, who I spoke to this morning, and confirm this to be the case?"
Secretary.
Well, that's a bit ironic, Presiding Officer, because this is a deficit that Fife Council and NHS Fife bequeathed to this IJB before it even started. So absolutely it is not acceptable. But if you really want to start changing this, Mr Rowley, then you need to talk to Fife Council and get them to come on board with the work that COSLA and I are trying to do with them and NHS Fife in order to address the deficit that they gave to that IJB. And so they're not bailing out the IJB. What they're actually doing is being forced in a really perverse way to address a deficit that they bequeathed in the first place. What we're trying to do is get them to stop telling the IJB to cut services, recognise that the IJB has the statutory responsibility and therefore the decision-making power for commissioning and planning those services, use the funding that both the NHS Fife and the Council have, including the additional funding for integrated joint services, to plan systematically to reduce what remains of that legacy deficit over a period of years. Let's say the 3 years that I have given health boards to plan their finances, and allow the IJB to work within the budget it's got without trying to repay a debt that belongs actually to NHS Fife and Fife Council in the first place.
Alexander Stuart, to be followed by Mark Ruskell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. With Fife Health and Social Care Partnership looking to tackle the budget gap, daycare services and care home closures are being considered. How will the Cabinet Secretary ensure that vital care for the elderly in the area will not be seriously affected?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, you know, we're having a bit of an irony bypass this morning, because can I remind the member that actually the additional funds to NHS Scotland, to our local authorities, and including an additional 160 million for integrated health and social care, are funds that he and his party sitting over there voted against. Yes. However, even nonetheless, on these benches we take our responsibilities seriously, even if our Scottish Conservative colleagues do not. So what we are doing is directly, my officials, COSLA officials, are engaging directly with the Council, with the Health Board and with the IJB to resolve this legacy debt bequeathed to the IJB without reducing capacity and cutting services. So that is what we are doing, and it would be very helpful to have members across this chamber engaged with us in supporting that in whatever manner they might wish to, rather than trying to score cheap political points off the back of it.
Mark Ruskell.
Cabinet Secretary will be aware of the redesign of GP out-of-hours services currently underway by the Fife Health and Social Care Partnership. There's a new multidisciplinary model that's emerging which could save the services that we've all been fighting for, but it will require additional resources. So will she commit to providing additional funding for training prescribing pharmacists and advanced nurse practitioners to deliver this new modern model for out-of-hours delivery across Fife?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to Mr Ruskell for that contribution. I am aware of the proposals that are in hand. We do have additional funds available to help both prescribing nurses and pharmacists in these matters, and we'll look at that proposal when it comes to me specifically.
Question number 2, Sandra White.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what discussions it has had with the DWP regarding progress with changing the state pension age for women in Scotland born in the 1950s.
Cabinet Secretary Shirley-Ann Somerville.
We've raised this issue with the UK Government on numerous occasions and made clear our position that it should take responsibility for the mishandling of this policy and provide transitional protection for those affected. These women have been badly let down by the UK Government, and it's disappointing that, despite the overwhelming evidence of the devastating impact these changes have had, nothing has changed at the UK Government level. It's time for the UK Government to accept their responsibility for the hardship they have created.
Sandra White.
I thank the Minister for that response. There obviously has been changes coming across. In light of the UK Government's punitive changes, which I've just mentioned, to pension credit, whilst women are again being penalised, can I ask the Minister to call on the UK Government to put in place fair transitional state pension arrangements and halt the reforms to pension credit, which will hit those who are most in need?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, in February I wrote to the Pensions Minister about the recent changes to pension credit eligibility, and I urged him to consider the impact of these changes, particularly on WASPy women who are part of a mixed-age couple and who will now find themselves doubly disadvantaged because of the UK Government policies. He did not address my points regarding the plight of the WASPy women in his reply, and we will continue to raise these issues with the UK Government. The strength of support from all parties, with the exception of the Scottish Tories, was evident in last night's members' debate led by Sandra White, and I would commend Sandra White and others involved in the cross-party group for their continued support of the WASPy women in their fight for justice.
Question number 3, John Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what it can do to help NHS Ayrshire and Arran reduce waiting times for treatment for mental health problems.
Minister Claire Hockey.
Since 2016, the Scottish Government has invested £1.8 million in NHS Ayrshire and Arran for capacity building and workforce development to improve mental health waiting times, with over £770,000 to come. This funding is currently paying for 8.8 whole-time equivalent staff, with another in recruitment. Alongside this, the Board is receiving support from the Mental Health Access Improvement Team to deliver frontline improvement projects to improve access to treatment. The Scottish Government is also investing an additional £4 million in CAMHS staff across Scotland who will be instrumental in supporting new services and reducing pressure on the system.
John Scott.
I thank the Minister for her answer, and she will be aware of the difficulties in accessing the CAMHS service, particularly in South Ayrshire, as well as the long waiting time for an appointment with a consultant psychiatrist. And she will know suicide numbers are rising, particularly in young men, but across all age groups, regrettably, with loneliness and isolation on the increase. What additional measures can the Scottish Government take to address these growing problems?
Minister.
I thank Mr Scott for his answer. He might be interested to know that the latest figures show that NHS Ayrshire and Arran 95% of CAMHS and 82% of psychological therapies patients were seen within 18 weeks, with an average wait of 7 weeks and 5 weeks respectively. However, the Scottish Government recognise that some people are still waiting too long, and we're determined to meet the waiting time standards across Scotland. And that's why we set up a new Mental Health Delivery Board, which I chair. It had its second meeting this week, and this will oversee improvement and activity and track performance. Boards have been asked to put in place improvement plans by April, setting out clear milestones over the next 2 years.
Monica Lennon.
Thank you. The Minister will be aware that Labour-led North Ayrshire Council is the first local authority in Scotland to have a dedicated mental health counsellor in each of its secondary schools. But the leader of the council, Councillor Joe Cullinan, has told me that demand for the service is so high that some schools already have waiting lists, and he's raised the issue of support out with the school day. What action will the Minister take to ensure that every secondary school in Scotland has the dedicated mental health counsellor like North Ayrshire, and what resources are available to make sure that the service is sufficiently resourced and the support doesn't end at the end of the school day?
Minister.
Monica Lennon, thank you very much for that question. You'll be aware that we have committed to school counsellors in every high school across Scotland. We have also, as I said in my previous answer, as Mr Scott, invested £4 million in CAMHS, which will deliver 80 additional staff, which will ease pressure across the system across the country. We've also committed to 250 additional school nurses and to rolling out mental health first aid training for teachers across all local authorities. And these measures, I believe, will help to ease some of the concerns that she has raised across Scotland, not just in Ayrshire.
Thank you. Question number 4, Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to Silverline Care Caledonia derecognising GMB Scotland as a trade union representing the staff in 6 of its care homes.
Minister Jamie Hepburn.
The Scottish Government's Fair Work Action Plan recognises the important role of trade unions, and we are committed to supporting strong trade unions for the benefit of workers and our economy. It is therefore regrettable when an employer chooses to derecognise a union. I would strongly urge both parties in this case to come together to reach an agreement.
Stuart McMillan.
I thank the Minister for that reply. Does the Minister consider that the decision is concerning? It's a concerning development at a time when care home staff across Scotland may actually feel undervalued, despite providing some of the most valuable services in society.
Minister.
Well, let me agree with Stuart McMillan. Our care home workers and our social care workers more generally provide an essential service, and I think that should be a very strong message from this place that we recognise their great value to our economy, to our society. In relation to the specific circumstances, the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport is aware of the situation, closely monitoring the situation. We will be willing to offer any support required, but the matter is being dealt with by ACAS right at this moment in time, and I would reiterate my message that we would strongly urge both parties in this situation to come together to reach an agreement through ACAS if necessary.
And Neil Findlay.
The derecognition of the GMB at Silverline comes on the back of derecognition of Unison at Cornerstone. This appears to be a deliberate anti-union stance that's emerging in the care sector. So what is the Government doing to stop this becoming a growing phenomenon in the care sector? And has the Minister met with the companies and the trade unions concerned to try and end this derecognition movement?
Minister.
I haven't at this stage. I will be willing to do so as is necessary. As I say, the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport is monitoring the situation. Clearly, it would be preferable if the parties could come together to resolve it. If it requires our further involvement, then we will, of course, consider that. ACAS are actively involved, and I hope both parties can come to an agreement and can come to an arrangement. But I would reiterate the point that I made. We greatly value the work of trade unions. We are working with trade unions, and I consider it a matter of the utmost regret in any circumstances where an employer actively derecognises a trade union.
Question number 5, Gail Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what steps it plans to take to re-engage the Rural GP Association with its remote and rural general practice working group.
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
The Rural Group Chair, Sir Lewis Ritchie, met with the new Chair of the Remote and Rural GPs Association on the 3rd of April. I understand the meeting was productive for all involved. Sir Lewis has acknowledged the concerns raised by our GPAS members and has agreed to hold further discussions in due course towards their continuing involvement in implementing the contract in our remote and rural communities. I have had discussions myself with Sir Lewis just as recently as last week, and will continue to keep in touch with them as this progresses.
Gail Ross.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. Indeed, it's very welcome to hear. But there is the perception that tangible progress is not being made in the Short Life Working Group. Will the Scottish Government commit to taking this feedback into account and refreshing the aims and objectives of the group with a view to reflecting the desire for the group to be more proactive?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to Ms Ross for that additional question. I am aware of that perception. I don't think it's entirely fair, but nonetheless it needs to be taken seriously, and indeed that was part of the discussion that I had with Sir Lewis. We will now take that feedback very seriously indeed, continue those discussions and look to see what more can be done so that the group can become more proactive in the work that we need it to take forward.
Miles Briggs, followed by Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I agree with Gail Ross's sentiments there, because as much as the Cabinet Secretary tries to dress this up, the Association of Rural GPs resigned because of due to the lack of progress actually being made to take on board rural GPs' concerns. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, will she agree to meet with a cross-party delegation on this to take forward these real concerns to make sure we get this GP contract right for every community in Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think it would be very helpful if we wait to see how Sir Lewis's discussions with the new chair of that group progress. But following that, and that should be in a very short timescale, because I'm keen that we do make progress on this and that we continue to engage that particular association in this work. So within very short timescale of understanding how that progress has been made, then I'm very content to meet with members to see what more might be done.
And Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm sure that the Rural GPs Association will re-engage if they are clear that their concerns are being heard and acted on, because there is real concerns about the contract. It flies in the face of health inequalities, and it certainly doesn't value the work of rural GPs. It also lacks oversight by the Technical Advisory Group on resource allocation. And I would ask the Cabinet Secretary if she will make sure that oversight is in place so that the contract can be in keeping with other health services.
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to Ms Grant for that. Of course, we do continue to have oversight, but I do think it is worth just noting for the record and also for members' information, this isn't a GP contract that the Scottish Government imposed on GPs. This is a contract that was negotiated and agreed with the BMA GP group. So a significant number, in fact a majority of GPs across the country voted for that contract and are already working it and seeing the benefit of it, including GPs in remote and rural practices. Nonetheless, there are additional concerns and we are attempting to address those, and I'm very happy to keep members up to date with the progress we make in that regard.
Question number 6, Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government, in light of the birth rate falling to its lowest level since records began in 1855, whether it will provide details of the steps that it will take to support people to have children, including supporting existing families to have more children.
Cabinet Secretary Shirley-Ann Somerville.
Deciding when and indeed if to have children is a matter of personal choice. The Scottish Government is working hard to create a country that is the best place in the world to grow up through a variety of initiatives aimed at supporting pregnant women, children and families. Our targeted support provided to families includes our Best Start pregnancy and baby payments, which have already awarded more than £2.7 million, the provision of universal free school meals for every child in P1 to 3, and a school clothing grant supporting approximately 120,000 children. We have also funded 600 hours of early learning entitlement for all 3- and 4-year-olds and eligible 2-year-olds, rising to 1140 hours from August 2020, and more than 80,000 baby boxes have been given to new parents across Scotland.
Kenneth Gibson.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. In the 20th century, Scotland's population growth was the lowest on earth, and last year our birth rate was a feeble 9.2 per 1,000 people, well below replacement level. By contrast, our northern neighbour, the Faroe Islands, had a fertility rate of 2.4 children born to each woman, one of the healthiest in Europe. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with the Scottish Government's own expert advisory group on migration and population that immigration alone cannot address regional or local depopulation and sustain communities, and therefore what will the Scottish Government do to research the barriers to Scots having children?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the decreasing birth rate is not new, nor is it unique to Scotland. A recent report from the National Records of Scotland suggested that some of the reasons behind this may be women maybe postponing childbearing to later ages, and the economic uncertainty influencing decisions around childbearing. That's why the Government is doing what it can to help overcome some of these uncertainties and has introduced a raft of new financial supports, some of which I outlined in my earlier answer. We're also taking wide-ranging action across government portfolios to tackle poverty by increasing income for work and earning, reducing household costs and maximising income from social security and benefits in kind. This is to ensure that Scotland is not only the best place to grow up, but also the best place to have children.
And question 7, Donald Cameron.
Scottish Government what action it is taking to support GP practices in rural areas.
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
GPs in rural communities do face distinct challenges, so our 2018-19 package of support that we put in place included financial support for recruitment incentives, financial support for relocation costs for GPs moving to rural posts, support for the Scottish Rural Medical Collaborative to develop recruitment and sustainability measures, including the £20,000 GP for GP scheme, support for GP recruitment and resilience schemes in the Highlands and Islands, additional support £500,000 to support rural dispensing practices and £150,000 to support IT improvements to rural health boards.
Donald Cameron.
A recent survey of rural GPs showed that 82% of its members believe that the outlook for rural healthcare is worse under the new contract, and 92% of its members would reject the contract if given an opportunity to vote now. So what reassurance can the Cabinet Secretary give to rural GPs who are clearly desperate and feel their voices are being ignored by her government?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, of course, given that that contract was negotiated with the BMA and was passed by GPs, including GPs in rural communities, and it is always worth making that point, this is not a contract that this government imposed on GPs. Nonetheless, We are continuing to work with the BMA, who also need to take account of some of those concerns. Working with them, I met them in fact only yesterday, to discuss what more we might do in terms of phase 2 of the contract, but also, as I said earlier to my colleague Gail Ross, some of the work that we're taking forward with Sir Lewis Ritchie to take account of those concerns in order to be able to specifically address them, in addition to that substantive package of comprehensive support that I outlined.
Thank you very much. That concludes general questions. We'll turn now to First Minister's questions. Question number 1, Jackson Carlow.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Yesterday, the head of Scotland's universities said that there is a growing concern that the students in some schools, particularly in deprived areas, are losing out because of the lack of subject choice. Does the First Minister agree?
First Minister.
I know there is an Education Committee inquiry into this just now. We will certainly look at its findings with interest. But broadly speaking, that is not my view. As Jackson Carlow will be well aware, under Curriculum for Excellence, there are no set notions about the number or types of qualifications taken at each stage of the senior phase. What matters is the qualifications and awards that pupils leave school with, not just what they study in S4, which is where some of the concerns expressed have been about. And when we look at attainment in our schools, what we are seeing is that at level 5, the numbers of pupils leaving with qualifications has risen. The same is true at level 6. The number of pupils going on into positive destinations is also at record levels, and there is now evidence, growing evidence, that the attainment gap between the richest and the poorest is beginning to close. So we will continue to pay close attention to these matters and continue to focus on what needs to be done to ensure that every young person in our schools gets the best possible education.
Jackson Carlow.
Well, you see, I believe that the breadth of subjects in which students can achieve qualifications does matter. Yep. And let's just examine what is now emerging. Whereas previously schools would offer around 8 subjects in S4, in a majority of cases that's now reduced to 6. Yep. A massive reduction in subjects like modern languages being taken in secondary school, with children in deprived parts of Scotland by far the worst affected. Now, we raised this a year ago with the First Minister, yet from the evidence we've heard this week, her government remains in complete denial. Why?
First Minister.
Well, again, as I'm sure Jackson Carlow is aware, the general phase of education now goes on to 3rd year, which is longer. There is a broader range of qualifications and other awards now available, and when we look, as I said in my previous answer, if you look at level 5 qualifications, the percentage of pupils getting a qualification at that level has risen since 2009. The same is true of qualifications at level 6, which is broadly speaking higher, and we're seeing the gap narrowing. So what we have to judge our education system by is not the number of qualifications in one particular year, but what young people are coming out of school with. We also see record numbers going into university, including record numbers from our deprived areas now going into university. So these are all positive developments, but of course we think there is more work still to be done, which is why we have the programme of reform of education underway.
Jackson Carlow.
The Minister does illustrate in that answer that she is in denial. You know, when our own main education agency was asked just yesterday by how many teachers we are short in each subject, they declared that they didn't know, but that they were looking into it. That brings us to the nub of the problem, because we learned this week 3/4 of schools say that a lack of teachers is constraining subject choice to some extent or to a great deal. No matter what spin she puts in it, teacher numbers are down under the SNP, down by 3,100. Isn't it simply the case that if you cut teacher numbers, you restrict the subjects pupils can take?
First Minister.
In terms of teacher vacancies, the number of vacancies in the subjects they're in will vary from time to time, but generally vacancy numbers are down in our schools. In terms of teacher numbers, since I became First Minister, teacher numbers have increased in Scotland by 1,242. We have the highest number of teachers in our schools now since 2010. We have the highest number of primary school teachers since 1980. And of course, the recent pay award for teachers will help us recruit and retain teachers even further. In fact, the contribution the Scottish Government has made to that award is specifically geared to do just that. And in terms of the issue of attainment. Let me just give a bit more detail of my earlier answers. Take qualifications at level 5, and I should say we have changed a little bit how these figures are counted, so I'll enter that caveat. But broadly speaking, where we're able to make a direct comparison, I know they may not want to hear this, but I suggest they listen. Yes. In 2006-07, when this government came to office, the percentage of pupils getting a level 5 qualification or better was just over 71%. That is now 85.9%. At level 6 hires, back in 2006, the percentage of pupils getting a level 6 or better qualification was 41.6%. Last year, that was 62.2%. So these are the facts. We are seeing attainment improve, and we are seeing the gap in attainment narrow. That is good progress, but I will be the first to say there is more work to do, and we're getting on and doing it.
Jackson Carlo.
Of course, the achievement of students is to be celebrated, but this question is about the breadth of subjects they can take qualifications in. And First Minister, over 1,000 people have written to the very inquiry that you just made reference to, confirming the point I have just made about teacher numbers reducing the availability of subjects in schools. First Minister Gail Gorman, the Chief Inspector of Education, said to this Parliament yesterday that the failure to recruit teachers can, and in some cases does, limit opportunities to lead extensive curriculum improvement. So we know that subject choice in Scottish schools has narrowed significantly under the SNP. And we know schools say that a lack of teachers, fewer in every single year this government has been in office, is a core reason. A year ago, when we raised this at First Minister's questions, Nicola Sturgeon said she would work hard to ensure young people had a wide choice of subjects to take in secondary school. Yet a year on, we're back here again. She said education would be our #1 priority. Isn't it time she acted as if it was our #1 priority?
First Minister.
Acting on it, which is why we're seeing the improvements that I've just cited in the Chamber. We see more people staying on longer at school. We see more people doing a broader range of subjects over a number of years. That is a good thing. That is exactly what Curriculum for Excellence is designed to achieve. In terms of teacher numbers have risen in each of the last 3 years. So now, of course, we do have a higher number of teachers than at any time since 2010. And as I said, a higher number of primary school teachers since I was at primary school. And of course, we are seeing attainment increase. So those are the facts. Now, Jackson Carlaw talks about difficulties around teacher recruitment. That's not something unique to Scotland. The Education Secretary in England, just in January, said it has become increasingly difficult to recruit and retain staff. So this is a challenge for many countries, but it is a challenge this government is addressing by the action we are taking to recruit and retain teachers. And we can see in the exam passes and qualification statistics that I've just cited that our young people are doing better as a result. And I would hope everybody across the chamber, even Jackson Carlaw, would find it within themselves to welcome that.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Presiding Officer, yesterday afternoon, the First Minister announced that she does not believe that the Prime Minister is ready to give ground on a Brexit deal. The Labour Party also continues to vehemently oppose a no-deal Brexit. And today we have returned in good faith to make concerted efforts to avoid that no-deal Brexit. But there is no escaping the fact that thanks to Theresa May and the Tories, we are now facing the cliff edge of a no-deal Brexit. So can the First Minister update Parliament and the country on her government's Resilience Committee's plans in the event of a no-deal Brexit next week?
First Minister.
The Scottish Government Resilience Committee will meet again this afternoon. I will chair that meeting, as I have chaired meetings on a weekly basis for some time now. We are planning across the whole range of our responsibilities to ensure that as far as we possibly can, we mitigate the impact of a no-deal Brexit. I'll be very candid with the Chamber. No matter how much planning or contingency work we do, it will not be possible to mitigate every impact of a no-deal Brexit should that happen, which is why it is so important all of us work to avoid that scenario arising. Yesterday in Westminster, I had firstly a very constructive meeting with Jeremy Corbyn. I also met with the Prime Minister. In the meeting with the Prime Minister, I set out to her again the Scottish Government's Single Market Customs Union compromise. That's not our first preference, but I said I was willing to look at, with the Prime Minister, where there may be issues of agreement around that. I also said I was willing and keen to talk to her about how we could allay, for example, our concerns about migration, given the demographic needs of Scotland. All I really got in return from the Prime Minister was the reasons why she didn't agree with me on these things and why her deal was actually the best one. So she wants to know where the rest of us are prepared to compromise, but I got no sense at all from her at any stage yesterday of where she is willing to compromise. And I think from what I read after his meeting with her, Jeremy Corbyn and his colleagues got pretty much the same impression. So if the Prime Minister wants to find a compromise, it's time she started to set out where she is prepared to compromise. And it's also time that everybody across the House of Commons unites behind initiatives like Joanna Cherry's motion earlier this week to make sure we take the risk of a no-deal Brexit away once and for all and forever.
Richard Leonard.
Can I welcome that cooperative tone? But let's focus on something specific. Let's focus on something specific to the Scottish situation, because last week the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer said that steps were being taken to deal with any shortfall of medicines as a result of a no-deal Brexit. The Health Secretary previously stated that the government wanted to have 6 weeks' notice, 6 weeks' worth of medicine in storage on top of normal stock levels by the end of March. Medicines like insulin, which over 30,000 people in Scotland rely on every day. So can the First Minister take this opportunity to reassure the public that Scotland now has access to 6 weeks' worth of reserves of all the medicines that we need?
First Minister.
That is the broad assurance we have from pharmaceutical companies. Of course, we continue to work to make sure that information is up to date and that those stockpiles remain, given that, of course, the date for a possible no-deal Brexit has changed and may change again. So these plans require to be kept under constant and ongoing review, and I can assure the Chamber that they will be. Obviously, we hope we are not in this situation. The Presiding Officer has indicated that if we are facing a no-deal Brexit at the end of next week, Parliament will be recalled from recess. I welcome that assurance, and the Government then will have the opportunity to set out up-to-date, up-to-the-minute date details of the preparations across a whole range of these issues. Presiding Officer, I couldn't help but notice that while Richard Leonard was asking me that very important and serious question, the Conservative benches were laughing. This is not a laughing matter. And every Conservative in this chamber and every Conservative politician across the country should be hanging their heads in shame at the fact that they have brought this country to the brink of crisis.
Richard Leonard.
Can I thank the First Minister for that answer? And let me turn to something else which is extremely serious. The Finance Secretary said that Brexit would represent an economic shock on the scale of the 2008 global financial crisis. So in the foreword to his budget, he said, and I can quote him, "However, if we face a no-deal or cliff-edge Brexit, I will have to return to Parliament to reassess our spending priorities." So when will the First Minister bring to this Parliament those revised spending priorities, and will she commit to presenting her proposals for consideration by Parliament next week in the event of a recall in the light of a no-deal Brexit possibility?
First Minister.
This is a serious issue. So let me say firstly, I hope the Finance Secretary does not have to return to Parliament with revised budget figures, because I hope we don't find ourselves in a no-deal scenario. If we do find ourselves in that scenario, it will be important that the Finance Secretary does that as quickly as possible. I don't think it would be reasonable to expect that to be next Thursday or Friday, but as soon as possible after that, for full consideration by the Parliament, he would intend to do that. if we are in this scenario, and as I say, let's all hope that that is not the case, there will be a substantial shock to the UK economy and to the Scottish economy. Within that, we will do whatever we can to mitigate the impacts of this, but many of these levers lie in the hands of the UK government. Firstly, many of the levers that would allow us to avoid a no-deal scenario, but also the levers that will require to be pulled if we find ourselves in that situation. When I was in London yesterday, also took part in the Cabinet Subcommittee, UK Cabinet Subcommittee on no-deal planning. John Swinney and Mike Russell have attended previous meetings of that subcommittee. One of the issues on the agenda was the UK government's planning for the economic response, and I made the point that I don't think the scale of what they're planning is sufficient to meet the potential scale of the challenge. So we will continue to do what we can, everything we can, and press the UK government to do likewise. But I repeat again, and this is an important, very important point, if we find ourselves leaving the European Union next week or at any stage with no deal, then we will, none of us, be able to properly and fully mitigate the impacts of that, which is why all of us should be focused on doing everything we possibly can to stop that happening.
I have a number of constituency supplementaries. The first from Liz Smith, to be followed by James Kelly. Liz Smith.
Thank you. First Minister, a constituent contacted me this week to inform me that she's been told by NHS Tayside that she is one of the 300 breast cancer patients who may have received a lower dose of chemotherapy than she should have done for her treatment. This issue was raised in the findings of the recent Healthcare Improvement Scotland report into NHS Tayside, but just as importantly, it was raised in the media almost a year ago. So can I ask why it has taken such a long time to address these concerns, and what steps the Scottish Government is taking to investigate the variations in cancer treatments across Scotland?
First Minister.
Firstly, a whistleblower wrote to the then Health Secretary, Shona Robertson, in May 2018 about this issue. Shona Robertson immediately arranged for that whistleblower to meet with the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer, and in July 2018 the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer asked Healthcare Improvement Scotland to examine the practice of lower dosage of chemotherapy in NHS Tayside, and that of course resulted in the publication of that report earlier this week. The findings and the recommendations of the HIS report were considered by an independent expert group to understand any potential impact on Tayside patients arising from the different approach, and the group has made clear that any risk of a negative impact to patients is small. A further expert group led by Professor Aileen Keel of the Scottish Cancer Task Force will fully consider all of HIS recommendations and how they can best be delivered, and it expects to report its findings in June. NHS Tayside, of course, has already announced that it will be making changes to its breast cancer chemotherapy treatment to bring them in line with the rest of Scotland. So I hope that gives some assurance on the particular issue. On the broader issue of variation across different health boards, this is something the Scottish Government looks at closely. For example, an atlas of variation often is a way of looking at some of those, and where there is apparent variation, it is then possible to look into whether that is for good reasons or not, and action can be taken. And this is an issue we take extremely seriously, as I hope the actions that the then Health Secretary took demonstrate.
James Kelly, to be followed by Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Workers at the Centrica call centre in Glasgow are deeply concerned at the news that 285 jobs are under threat with their site facing closure. The proposed jobs cuts in Glasgow are the thin end of the wedge and will be deeply worrying to workers and their families. Any loss of these jobs would have an adverse effect not only in Glasgow but the wider Scottish economy. I know as a Glasgow MSP the First Minister will share my concerns about this development, but can I ask the First Minister what steps the Scottish Government can take to support the workforce in their efforts to ensure that these regressive job cuts do not go ahead?
First Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to James Kelly for raising an issue. I do very much share the concerns he's expressed in the Chamber, and I'm concerned to learn of the developments at British Gas, and my thoughts, of course, are with the employees affected. Jamie Hepburn, the Business Minister, is pursuing a call with both Centrica and the GMB as soon as it's possible for that to happen. Scottish Enterprise is also establishing contact with the company and will provide whatever support it can. Of course, British Gas is the UK's largest energy supplier. It's a significant employer in Scotland, and we want to do everything we can to protect jobs within it. So I will ask Jamie Hepburn to ensure that he keeps James Kelly up to date, and indeed any other Member of Parliament who has a constituency interest in this matter.
And Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, it gives me no pleasure to raise yet again failures on the Borders Railway. However, just today there were 2 peak time cancellations, and as a result of overcrowding on later trains, 2 people fainted, 1 even requiring medical assistance, and there was also a pregnant woman made ill. Does the First Minister agree with me that for Alec Hines to claim at committee last week customers are already benefiting from improved service delivery, that he needs to get out and about on the Borders trains to hear what my constituents think of his improvements?
First Minister.
Well, I completely agree that this level of discomfort and inconvenience for passengers as a result of overcrowding in no way reflects the service level for which this government and indeed Scottish taxpayers, of course, are paying. I've been informed that the cancellations today are a consequence of a train that failed early this morning, but I will certainly reinforce to Mr Hines and his colleagues the critical nature of providing a service that passengers can rely on and feel safe and comfortable to use. Improvements across ScotRail's services have been patchy, with passengers in the east of the country continuing to be let down by ScotRail. The Cabinet Secretary met with senior Abellio officials on Monday this week to reinforce the absolute requirement for improvement. I said a couple of weeks ago in this chamber that ScotRail is in the last chance saloon, and I repeat that today. They must meet the commitments contained in the performance remedial agreement that they have now signed up to.
And Tom Mason.
Thank you. The First Minister will be aware that teacher absences in Aberdeen have been risen by 60% in the last year alone, reaching a total of 2,486 staff days since September 2018. Why does the First Minister think that our teachers are so stressed that they need to have so much leave? And what does she plan to do about it?
First Minister.
Well, we're working hard to reduce unnecessary workload on the part of teachers. We've also just agreed with the teaching unions a pay deal that will significantly increase the pay of teachers and the recognition for the job that they do. Obviously, I'm happy to ask the Education Secretary to speak to the local council about if there are particular issues in that part of the country, but we will continue to take the actions I've already outlined in the chamber today to ensure that teacher numbers continue to rise and be appropriate to the level of demands that are placed on our teachers.
Question number 3, Willie Rennie.
I want to ask some questions on an area of agreement. I share the First Minister's anxiety that there may be a hasty Brexit agreement between the leader of the Labour Party and the Prime Minister. And because that agreement will not be in the withdrawal agreement, it could be unpicked by Boris Johnson if he takes over from Theresa May later this year. When she met Jeremy Corbyn yesterday, did she get an indication about how he was going to address this issue? And on a people's vote, it seems clear to me that if there is an agreement between the Prime Minister and the leader of the Labour Party, there will be no people's vote. Is that her understanding?
First Minister.
Well, on the first issue, I am very concerned that a deal may lead to a legally binding withdrawal agreement being passed that would irrevocably take the UK out of the EU on the strength of non-legally binding commitments about the future relationship that could, as Willie Rennie says, be ripped up by a future Prime Minister, perish the thought, such as Boris Johnson. That is a concern I expressed strongly to Jeremy Corbyn and his colleagues yesterday, and it's up to him whether he wants to listen to me, but said if I was in his shoes, I would be very, very wary about doing a deal on that basis with the Prime Minister. In terms of a people's vote, it wasn't clear to me from my discussions with Jeremy Corbyn yesterday which way the Labour Party will go on that issue. There is obviously a division within the Labour Party, that's fair enough, but I think it is absolutely vital, given the mess that this process has become, that what we don't see is a cobbled together, behind closed doors, least worst compromise cooked up between the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition. Far better now to request a long extension from the EU, to fight the European elections to make that possible. By all means then to allow the Commons to come up with what a compromise might look like, but then ask the people across the UK whether they want to accept a second best compromise, or whether actually now, given everything we've learned over the past 3 years, they might think the best option for the whole of the UK is to remain in the EU.
Willie Rennie.
I think that's right, because we Remainers are concerned that a deal could be done behind closed doors, giving away the real benefits of the European Union without having the people having that final say. I just want to be clear about compromise. She's talked about it today, she talked about it yesterday, she's referred to our paper in 2016 that talked about single market membership and also the customs union. That was her main position until I charmed her to support the people's vote. Well, she did change her mind after I asked her. Can I have some clarity about what she now means about compromise? Will she insist on a people's vote in all circumstances, or is she considering reverting to her original position?
First Minister.
I would encourage Willie Rennie to keep up with the charm. I think it is much more befitting of his status in this Parliament. But I want to see a people's vote in all circumstances. I think I've tried to set this out before. This is not a situation of my choosing. It's not a situation of Willie Rennie's choosing. My preference is for Scotland to remain in the EU, and I will do everything I can to try to bring that option about. But if we are faced with that choice no longer at any stage, and I hope this is not the case, with that choice no longer being open to the UK, it will always be open to Scotland down a different route that I continue to hope to charm Willie Rennie into agreeing with. But if that option is no longer available to the UK, then I will want to protect Scotland against a hard Brexit. And that's why we've put forward previously, and indeed voted in the House of Commons on Monday night, for a single market customs union compromise. But that is not my preference. So right now, I think those of us who want to see this Brexit mess stopped in its track and the UK given the option of staying in the EU should continue to be fully behind efforts to put this issue back to the people. I think that's the right thing to do now. Indeed, I think it's the most democratic thing to do now.
Some further supplementaries. The first from Ruth Maguire, to be followed by Alex Rowley.
Presiding Officer, a study published in the British Medical Journal links the introduction of the HPV vaccine a decade ago with a 90% reduction in cancer-causing HPV in Scotland, demonstrating the significant and continued benefits of the vaccination programme. Can the First Minister confirm the Scottish Government's intention to roll out the vaccine to boys, and if so, when will this happen?
First Minister.
Well, I really welcome this positive report from the British Medical Journal. In Scotland, uptake for the HPV immunisation programme remains high and continues to exceed 80%. And what we saw in that report today is that that is leading to a 90% reduction in the cancer-causing HPV in Scotland, which is absolutely remarkable and wonderful. The Scottish Government remains committed to our efforts to ensure that girls benefit from this vaccine, which, as the study shows, will save lives, is saving lives. And we want to build on this success, and we will extend the HPV vaccine programme to boys later this year. Of course, it remains important, meantime, that women continue to take up the invitation for the regular cervical screening. Smear tests save lives. It's a unique test as it can prevent the disease before it even begins, and treatment as a result of screening prevents 8 out of 10 cervical cancers from developing. But I hope everybody across the chamber today will welcome the news that the HPV vaccine is already an enormous success story.
Alex Rowley, to be followed by Jamie Green. Alex Rowley.
Presiding Officer, it's now clear that Fife has lost out on the £2.8 billion worth of work from the Murray and Kincardine wind farm projects. In fact, it is a fact that as part of that consent for Kincardine, there was commitments given to substantial amounts of work to be done in Scottish yards. What is the First Minister going to do about developers reneging on those commitments to Scottish yards? And given that the Fife yards are owned by Scottish enterprise, what action plan is going to be put in place to ensure that investment comes into the Fife yards to ensure that they are fit for the future?
First Minister.
Well, can I thank Alex Rowley for raising this issue? I, with the Finance Secretary, met with DF Barnes last week, the owners now of BiFab, and we had the opportunity to discuss their understandable frustrations that we share about the recent experience of bidding for some of these contracts. We also discussed issues around investment in and infrastructure at the yards, and we were able to assure the company that we will continue to do everything we can to support them, and those discussions are ongoing. We also discussed, and I know this is an issue that has been raised by Gary Smith and Pat Rafferty of the Unions Consent concerned about real concerns about whether or not, and probably not, BIFAB is operating on a level playing field. I think I said when Alec Rowley last raised this issue that we're going to convene a summit to look at some of those issues and try to get to the heart of that, because I believe strongly, very, very strongly, that BIFAB should have and indeed does have a bright future if we can resolve some of these issues. And I'm absolutely determined that working with the company, working with the unions and working with others, we will resolve these issues and make sure this company does have the future it deserves.
Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I've raised the issue of free personal care in this chamber numerous times with the First Minister. Just yesterday I received correspondence confirming that in North Ayrshire is a backlog of 100 people waiting for funding. The correspondence from the Health and Social Care Partnership reads, free personal care can only be provided within available financial means, but due to budgetary pressures, there is a waiting list for funding. Every one of those people are waiting for funding, for a solution to meet their needs. First Minister, if free personal care is so universal, then why are so many waiting?
First Minister.
Well, free personal care is there, has been there for many years for those over 65 who are assessed as needing it. Of course, as of Monday this week, it has been extended to those under 65s. I'm happy to look at the correspondence, have the Health Secretary look at the correspondence if the member wishes to pass it to us. But it is important that we work with integration authorities to make sure that those who are assessed as needing care get it. Of course, I'd say, gently, we would, if we followed the Tory proposals on our budget, of course, we'd have to be taking hundreds of millions of pounds out of the budgets of the health service and integration authorities. We are increasing the money that's going to the health service, we're increasing money that's going into social care, and of course those are proposals for increased funding that the Tories voted against when this Parliament considered the budget.
Stuart Stevenson.
This week we heard Michelle Ballantyne say, I would be quite happy if the government had nothing to do with the running of the NHS. This is a lady who received her education as a nurse from the NHS, who worked in the NHS. Is it not absolute Tory hypocrisy that she now seeks to undermine the NHS?
First Minister.
I think the Scottish Conservatives are probably starting to wish that Michelle Ballantyne would make fewer interventions in this chamber. But I was in London yesterday, I wasn't in the chamber, I didn't hear the comments. I have seen them as reported. And I think, well, as far as I'm concerned, the NHS must always stay in public ownership, in public hands, run by the public. And as long as I or my party have anything to do with it, that will continue to be the case. But I do think Michelle Ballantyne's comments yesterday will underline the concern that many people have that the NHS would not be safe in Conservative hands because they'd want to privatise it at the first opportunity they got.
Question number 4, Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister how the new Domestic Abuse Act will help reduce violence against women.
First Minister.
The Domestic Abuse Scotland Act 2018 came into effect on Monday. It creates a specific offence covering not just physical abuse but forms of psychological abuse that were previously difficult to prosecute under existing law. We know that the vast majority of victims of domestic abuse are women. Strengthening the law is one part of Equally Safe, our strategy to prevent and eradicate all forms of violence against women and girls. We've worked closely with justice partners to ensure that the justice system is ready for its implementation, including funding Police Scotland to support the development of training for 14,000 police officers and staff. And an extensive public awareness campaign has been launched to raise awareness of the fact that psychological abuse and coercive and controlling behaviour is domestic abuse.
Rona Mackay.
Can I thank the First Minister for that answer? Coercive and controlling behaviour has the most damaging and long-lasting effects on individuals. Does the First Minister agree with me that the public awareness campaign will send a clear warning to abusers that all forms of domestic abuse are criminal and that perpetrators shall expect to find the full consequences of their abusive behaviour?
First Minister.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think it's also important that we do have the public awareness campaign to ensure that the public is aware that the law has changed and that victims understand how they can get help. In fact, that victims understand that behaviour of this nature is a crime. I visited with the Justice Secretary, Women's Aid in the East End of Glasgow last week and spoke to two survivors of this type of abuse. And they say that for many people suffering this abuse, often the first barrier is making them understand that it is behaviour that is unacceptable. So we must reinforce the message that coercive and controlling behaviour is domestic abuse, and that this new legislation will help to hold perpetrators to account. That public awareness campaign that I've mentioned is running across multiple platforms, television, radio, online and print, and we're working with a number of third sector groups, Women's Aid, Assist, the Shakti Women's Aid and Abused Men in Scotland to develop this campaign. And again, I hope it's something that all members will get fully behind.
Margaret Mitchell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I too warmly welcome the new Domestic Abuse Act. However, the Management of Offenders Bill makes it possible for domestic abuse and sexual offenders who would otherwise be in prison to be released and monitored electronically. And if they then breach exclusion zone conditions, there is a very real danger of something adverse happening very quickly to domestic abuse victims. How will the First Minister ensure that these breaches will be responded to in real time with the immediacy required to protect these victims?
First Minister.
Well, we will continue to work very closely with organisations like Women's Aid, who represent women who have been the victims of abuse, to make sure that as we take forward broader reforms in our justice system, then the needs of those who suffer abuse are absolutely at the heart of everything that we do. And in fact, in terms of recent changes or changes in train around the presumption against short sentences, that's a discussion that is taking place. Sentencing, of course, is not a matter for government. Sentencing is a matter for courts. As a result of the new bill, and I think this was an amendment introduced by Linda Fabiani, of course, there is now a duty on courts in all domestic abuse cases to consider imposing a non-harassment order to protect the victim, and that will enable the criminal court for the first time to use a non-harassment order to protect children as well as the adult victim of the offence. So these are important issues to raise, and it's absolutely vital that in all aspects of the justice system we have victims of domestic abuse very much at the heart of everything we do.
Question number 5, Miles Briggs.
To ask the First Minister whether she will provide details of the scope and remit of the Scottish Government's new task force to tackle drug deaths.
First Minister.
Public Health Minister will convene an expert group to examine the key drivers of drug deaths and advise on what further changes, either in practice or in the law, could help save lives and reduce harm. As was outlined in the new drug and alcohol strategy a few months ago, we must recognise that there are limitations in relation to public health outcomes associated with the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971. It's also the case, of course, as I think everybody appreciates, that the issue of drug deaths is complex. No one approach, one group or one service can do all that is needed. So it's important that we make sure everybody is working together. And the expert group that is being established will also learn from the Dundee and Glasgow work on drug deaths to help inform our continued efforts to tackle this issue.
Miles Briggs.
Does the First Minister understand the frustration of families across Scotland that it's taken the SNP government so long to wake up to this tragedy across our country? Anna Sawar, Monica Lennon and myself called for this action over the last 3 years, and SNP ministers have failed to act. Now, given the level of concern about drug deaths across our country, how will the First Minister make sure that colleagues across this chamber are part of this task force, that experts and charities, many of whom agree with us that it's time we urgently see a new focus on helping people end and not just manage their addictions? How will everyone be included to make sure that work's taken forward?
First Minister.
Well, we will continue to work across the chamber to do the right things in what is a complex and challenging issue. I represent a constituency, as the member knows, in Glasgow. I regularly speak to those who have experience of drug use and families who have been affected by drug use, and those conversations often underline for me the complexity of this issue, but also some of the things that we need to do. And I think it's important, as I said in an exchange a couple of weeks ago with Jackson Carlaw, that we are prepared to look not just at some of the traditional actions we take, but at new approaches as well. The issue of safe consumption facilities is one that is raised regularly in this chamber, which the Tories, in a seemingly knee-jerk way, have just set their face completely against. And you know, the Home Office actually wrote in a letter to the Glasgow Health and Social Care Partnership that they acknowledge that there is some evidence for the effectiveness of drug consumption rooms in reducing health risks for drug users. So if we're to be serious about this, all of us have to be serious about it. All of us have to have the humility to accept that some things in the past haven't worked, and we have to be prepared to have new approaches. But that cuts both ways. If opposition parties want, as I hope they do, to be part of this, then I would again ask the member to rethink this issue, and when he has done so, perhaps use any influence he has in the UK Government to change their position on this, because changing on their position on this would be one way of helping us take these issues forward in a positive way.
John Finney.
Thank you, President Officer. Can I thank the First Minister for her comments? She's aware of the clamour for action about this public health crisis. There's a clamour too, First Minister, from people with drug problems to get opiate replacement therapy. The figure at the moment is 35% in Scotland, it's 60% in England, and a third of the drug-related deaths in 2014, the individuals had no contact with drug treatment. Some issues, and I welcome the task force and its anticipated work, some issues can't wait. Well, the First Minister, as a matter of urgency, addressed an acceptably low percentage of people with drug problems in treatment and ensure optimum prescribing and support to tackle the unacceptable level of deaths.
First Minister.
I am happy to ensure that this is an issue that is looked at. I'm sure this is an issue that has been and is being looked at, that it may be something that the expert group wants to look at in the early stages of its work. Obviously, prescribing decisions are for clinicians to take based on the best interests and the needs of those that they're prescribing for. But the disparity that John Finney has just cited there in terms of opiate replacement prescribing rates is certainly something that I think in the full scope of this work should be looked at. My view on this is that nothing should be off the agenda here. This is a serious, complex, challenging issue. Some things that are already being done we know are effective. Other things are perhaps not effective, and there are things that are not currently being done that we have to open our minds to. And I think if everybody involved has that spirit, then here in Scotland, as we have done in so many other public health issues, can find a way of leading in the right direction on this, and that's what I hope we can achieve.
And question 6, Pauline McNeill.
To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government response is to reports that many pregnant women and homeless children are being housed by local authorities in substandard temporary accommodation.
First Minister.
Temporary accommodation provides an important safety net in emergencies, and our Ending Homelessness Together action plan is very clear that this accommodation must be high quality with stays as short as possible. The vast majority of families with children or pregnant women are given temporary accommodation in the social rented sector. For others, the unsuitable accommodation order provides extra protection to ensure that families don't stay in unsuitable accommodation, for example, bed and breakfast, for more than 7 days. Breaches of that should not be tolerated, and the Housing Minister has already met with councils concerned to discuss solutions. As part of our plans to transform temporary accommodation later this year, we will also consult on extending that protection to all homeless households, and the consultation will ask for views on suitable sanctions for any council that fails to comply.
Pauline McNeill.
Thank you. I know that the First Minister talks about high-quality temporary accommodation, but all over the country people are being put in smelly, run-down private hotels and bed and breakfast, mainly due to a lack of social housing stock at exorbitant cost to the taxpayer. The Herald on Sunday confirmed horror stories of single rooms in grotty hotels with no cooker, no fridge, and residents being locked out for being 5 minutes late in getting to their accommodation. In some cases, there's nothing temporary about some temporary accommodation. I would ask the First Minister if we could focus on what could be done immediately to recognise the scandal. I know there's a lot of ongoing work, but would the First Minister kick into touch recommendation 20 of Social Bite Commission's report, which looks at enforcing legally enforceable standards for temporary accommodation, starting with at least the right to a cooker and the right to a fridge?
First Minister.
Yes, we will consider all recommendations of that nature. As I said in my original answer, one of the things we will consult on are suitable sanctions for councils who are not complying with the rules in this area. I think it's important to say that the vast majority of families are in temporary accommodation in the socially rented sector. We have that time protection now for families, women with children and pregnant women, and that's what we're looking to extend. And breaches of that, in part the increase in breaches is due to the restriction of the time limit, but breaches are not acceptable, which is why the Housing Minister has been taking action with the councils concerned. But the recommendations that came from our task force, we are determined to implement those recommendations so that we transform temporary accommodation, but also in a broader sense reduce the circumstances in which anybody has to go into temporary accommodation in the first place.
Thank you, and that concludes First Minister's questions, but a point of order first from Mr Stevenson.
Earlier in questions, Tom Mason raised an issue relating to teachers in Aberdeen. I'm aware, as some others will be, that he is the councillor for Midstockett and Rosemount in Aberdeen. I'm sure it was utterly inadvertent on his part not to draw our attention to that fact. Will you now give him the opportunity to put on the record that he had an interest in the matter he raised?
Thank you, Mr Stevenson. That is neither a point of order and, as you will know, is a matter for members' judgment whether or not to declare an interest. That concludes First Minister's questions. We're going to move on now to members' business.
Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause, well more than a year since Alison Thulis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.